Welcome to this Asia Global Podcast brought to you by the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. I'm your host, Alejandro Reyes, the Institute's Director of Knowledge Dissemination. In our programs here in Hong Kong and online, and in the content that we produce, we focus on presenting Asian perspectives on global issues. Subscribe to Asia Global Online, our weekly digital journal, by going to the Asia Global Online or the Asia Global Institute website. And follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. Now, in this podcast, we are joined from Manila in the Philippines by a legend. Jaime FlorCruz is a veteran China watcher and one of the longest serving foreign correspondents in China. While on a 3-week study tour of China in 1971, he was forced into political exile from his Philippine homeland and unexpectedly found himself stranded in China at the height of the tumultuous Cultural Revolution. He worked on a state farm in Hunan province and also in a state fishing company in Shandong province, and then studied the Chinese language and history at Peking University, known as Beida. Following China's opening in the late 1970s, he got work as a journalist with Newsweek magazine and later spent many years working as a correspondent for Time magazine and CNN out of Beijing. Jaime has witnessed and reported on the most significant events in China's past 4 decades and more, including the country's economic and social reforms. He still lives in Beijing and is an adjunct professor at Peking University, his alma mater. So welcome, Jimmy. It's really lovely and a privilege to see you.
It's good to be with you, Al.
Great.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, we're talking in this episode about Jimmy's new book, a memoir, really, titled The Class of 77, meaning 1977, How My Classmates Changed China. Now, that's my first question, Jimmy. Tell us about the title of the book, because it doesn't actually mean that you graduated from Beida in 1977. It actually has to do when members of your class took the dreaded Gaokao.
Yes.
So tell us a bit about that, and tell us a bit about the Gaokao and what it's all about.
Yeah. So why 1977? 1977, the year after, 1 year after Chairman Mao's death, it's also the year when Deng Xiaoping came back to power. And when Deng Xiaoping came back to power, he had this grand vision for China, reform, opening up. But then soon he realized that he didn't have the pool of talent to execute his grand vision. And one of his first moves or decisions was to restore the so-called Gaokao, which means the national college entrance exam. It dates back to the imperial times when government or imperial officials had to go through rigorous exams, and when whoever passed were recruited into the imperial government. The same time, in 1977, they restored the Gaokao, which had been suspended for 9 years when Chairman Mao started the Cultural Revolution. And so for 9 years, no entrance exam. When the universities finally reopened, students were enrolled not based on academic ability, but based on ideological purity, political loyalty and reliability. And they enrolled from among the workers, peasants, and soldiers, and that's why they were called 工农兵学院. So 1977 was the year when we entered college, and something like 5 million youth, Chinese youth, took the exam that year. Why? Because many high school graduates of the previous years did not take the
Right.
exam. And for many of them who already had spent years on the farm or factories or served in the army, this was the last chance for them to change their careers or their lives by taking this exam. And so of the 5 million plus who took the exam, something like 400,000 to 500,000 were enrolled in different colleges and universities in China. So I was fortunate to be part of that cohort who entered college, in my case, Peking University, in 1977.
Right.
That's why we're called the class of
Of
77.
77. Now, in fact, it's interesting because of that kind of backup, if you will,
Yeah.
of people. That the class of 77, the entry class of 77,
That's right.
that you ended up having quite a number of interesting personalities and people of different ages, right?
Yes,
And you know, and of course, you were there as a foreign student, so in fact, you didn't have to take the Gaokao for admission.
I didn't have to take the rigorous 3-day exam
Right.
because I was a foreign student and they recognized that I already had taken university courses in the Philippines, 3 years of that before I got to China. So I was spared of the torture
Right.
of the Gaokao. Instead, I was just given a placement examination for my Chinese, my Mandarin.
Right.
They wanted to make sure that I could cope with the classes, which were totally in Mandarin at that time.
Right. Now, which brings us to a particular issue in terms of while you didn't have to take the Gaokao, that go through that torture, you did have quite a grueling effort in order to get to the point where you could be a student and gain admission into Beida. Indeed, you know, this is a fantastic book, Jeremy.
Thank you.
It's such a great read. It's so interesting, and it brings you into a lot of the what was really happening at that time, and then also how things changed, even in that short period that you focus on. So you know, your story is really full of ironies, right? So let me just mention one. So you were a student activist in the Philippines, a country that had been sort of a developing democracy, but it was falling into authoritarian rule with the advent of President Ferdinand Marcos, and then suddenly you're thrust into a situation where you have to build a life in a fairly highly regimented country during a tumultuous period. So you write in great detail about how you built that new life, going from essentially being a refugee to a farm worker, to a worker on a trawler, to a student at the best university in the land, majoring in history. So it's really a unique story. It's epic. It's mythic, really, and a unique story that you chronicle so well, and you touch on everything from the daily life, the challenge of learning Mandarin, dealing with bureaucracy, coming to know classmates, roommates, even your love life, which I think is really, truly fantastic. It's a fascinating story. How long did it take you before, when you got to China and all that period? And I won't spoil it for the readers because you really take us through that grueling effort it took to settle in. But how long did it take you before you felt reasonably settled in China? And was there a moment when you realized that, hey, I'm going to be okay? When you figured out that you would be fine, despite the pangs of homesickness and all the things that really endured during your whole stay there?
Yeah, well, first, I think it took me maybe 3 years to kind of acknowledge and settle with the fact that it could take longer than the few months that we thought we could that needed to be able to return home. 3 years because in our second year, martial law was declared in the Philippines, which I thought dimmed any possibility. Although I was still hopeful that martial law wouldn't last long.
Because you were concerned you would be arrested on returning home.
Yes. Yeah, I was one of the 5 who
Yes.
who were worried that we could be arrested had we gone home. So when martial law was declared, was imposed, yeah, we thought that dimmed the prospect. But I was still hopeful that, yeah, it wouldn't last very long, that people would rebel against it. But another year later, my passport expired. Philippine passports at that time are only good for 3 years. So when that happened, I had to kind of force myself basically to face this harsh reality that it could be a long wait. And so how long did it take for me to settle down? I suppose not until I got comfortable with Mandarin, which probably was 1975, 76, when I was going through a formal Mandarin classes at Beijing Languages Institute. So it must have taken 5 to 6 years till I finally got settled in this adoptive new home, China.
Well, it's interesting because you say that, because I think as you go along, you talk about periods where people recognize you as a foreigner, or periods where you could pass as Chinese.
A fake foreigner.
Right, a fake foreigner, as you put it. And I find that interesting because I find myself here in Hong Kong kind of like that. When I speak Cantonese, if I can kind of get away with it, where people continue to speak to me in Cantonese, then it makes me feel better, more settled, right? And so I think that feeling was probably what you were
It did. It helped to be able to blend with the crowd, and also to be able to conduct a conversation to the point that they forget that you were not Chinese.
Right.
And so that gives you that sense of acceptance, and adapted, that you have adapted well in what used to be an alien situation.
Right. So tell us also, I think you were fortunate that you had certain skills and pastimes that lent themselves to being assimilated. I mean, your singing,
yes,
your ability to speak English, I think, was also helpful, because a lot of people sought you out for that. Yes. And then your sporting life, your particularly basketball. Tell us a bit about that, because I think it was interesting, and you were on the varsity basketball team at Beida.
Yeah, I attribute that to traits of Filipinos. We are very adaptable. We are very resilient and resourceful, and we love singing and dancing.
Dancing, I forgot the disco.
Yeah, the disco, right. And then basketball. Yes, we all love the basketball. And so that was a good segue for me to get into the varsity team. And it's more than just sports. With the team, with my teammates, I really learned a lot more about China through their eyes, through their lives. The life of, like, Tang Wenfang. I write about his own kind of sad love story that he shared with me. Right. And so I shared a lot of happy times with my teammates, traveling outside Beijing, playing with the team. And then getting into this television program on national television, teaching English and English songs. Right. On national television. To me, those were just happy segue into different facets of China. And through those, I learned a lot about China, but also I made a lot of friends among Chinese. I was fortunate to have been able to do that. And again, I attribute that to my upbringing as a Filipino.
Well, indeed, I mean, just the dancing, the DC Kerr, right?
Yeah, this is,
That that was an entryway to a romance, actually, right? I mean, the dancing, the waltzing, actually, it was the
yes,
waltz.
yeah, it
That
was.
was. So tell us a bit about that, because that was a kind of, I mean, just reading your account of that romance that you had, that it really was significant because it brought to the fore the way Chinese society was at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about that, just briefly.
Yeah, I think many of us kind of forget, and especially many young observers of China forget how difficult and different China was in the 70s. Yeah, in terms of cultural mores, tradition, and how stubborn that tradition had been on people. And among that is their view on love and romances. And in my case, love and romances between a Chinese and a foreigner. It was and we were told in very clear terms in the beginning of our stay there that it's not allowed. Intermarriage, or I guess liaison between foreigner and Chinese were not allowed at the height of the Cultural Revolution. There were rumors in the beginning, maybe 1972, 73, that Zhou Enlai had already suggested it's okay, but then the radicals, or the conservatives inside the party just refused to allow that. And that's why in the book I kind of chronicle some of my personal experiences, which one would think, or I had thought it was a normal thing to do, to be attracted to or fall in love with the opposite sex, and in my case, and then you rudely are realized that no, it's not possible, it's not allowed, and it was painful, and for a long time I had to grapple with that. It took I think it took Deng Xiaoping sometime in 1978 or 9 for a first foreign Chinese marriage to be allowed, and it reached the very top of the Chinese bureaucracy, and that started this very gradual change of China kind of accepting and adapting to the modern world.
Right. Interesting, and indeed, I again, I don't want to spoil it for the readers, because really your book is so cinematic in its way.
Thank you.
That the other romance that you talk about brings to the fore the change that occurred in terms of those social mores in just a few years, really.
Yes.
And then, of course, the reason that romance ended was also
For different
indicative of how things had changed. Right.
Correct. It was China in a state of flux, and that reflected even on interpersonal relations and on how Chinese made career decisions or life decisions. And so the second part was love allowed,
right?
And yet it's there were still obstacles, or new factors came in to condition change decision making on the part of some Chinese. And I'm looking back, I totally understand the personal decisions that people made, and in a way, looking back, I hope my readers would appreciate just how difficult these changes had been, and some things that we just assume should be like that love, marriage,
Right.
careers, were not true, or were not allowed as as recently as 30 years ago, or
Right.
40 years ago.
It all recalled for me a comment that a mainland professor that I know told me once, that many Chinese have had to live in a kind of schizophrenic kind of life where they have almost two different types of lives, and they
Yeah,
conduct them at the same time. And
yeah,
and and, and you essentially were even more burdened because you really did have two different cultures that you were trying to
yeah.
live. You
To live
yeah,
and to mix.
to mix, right?
Yeah, yeah. That was a painful part, because yeah, but especially when, I'm sorry, when you have when you already have the the choices that you knew other societies or other cultures allow, and then suddenly you are plunked into this very different uh, society, which did not allow what we think are normal, kind of assumed rights. It was painful. And so, yes, the changing culture uh, mirror, or my experiences actually mirror how the changing China was going through on the ground level.
Right. Now, you in this class of 77, you had you talk about three roommates, and they all have many different things to to tell in terms of their
Yeah.
stories. I was particularly interested in Zhang Wenran because, of course, he's quite well known in
In Canada.
Canada
Yes.
among China watchers, and had no idea, knowing Zhang Wenran, that he had been your roommate. And also, you had in this class of 77 very important people in China today, going from Li Keqiang, who is the current premier
Yeah.
of China, Bo Xilai, who had been a Politburo member, and of course has encountered some difficulties and is now in prison.
Yeah.
And Yi Gang, who is the governor of the People's Bank of China. So
Yeah.
they're alone, but not just on that establishment side, which I find interesting, but you also talk about members of this class of 77 who are on the other side
Yeah.
of power, if you will. And you
Yeah.
talk about a cage protester in New York,
New York.
named by Wang Juntao.
Yes.
Right now. Again, without trying to spoil it for the readers, tell us a bit about what it was like then or what it is like to now look back and see all these personalities who have grown up into these, some of them rather heroic, rather important, rather, in some cases, like Wang Juntao, you get a sense that he's a little bit of a Don Quixote to some extent, right?
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that, because it must be a really
A very special,
very
a
special,
very special
and the
gentleman.
feelings must really be very mixed in terms
Yeah.
of how you feel.
Well, they're very special because they, by the time they entered Peking University, they had already, most of them had a very rich social experience. Some had worked on farms, like typical youth. Some had worked in factories, served in the army. And so what's special about them is they're very thoughtful. They're very passionate about what they went through, what went wrong during the Cultural Revolution, and they were passionate about where to China, what did reform mean, what are the risks involved. What, opening China's door, what did it mean? They were very hungry, very determined, and very passionate. And that explains why they went different directions. One of them described it as the Beidaren spirit, the spirit of Peking University alumni. It's the spirit of exploration. It's the spirit of determining China's future, be part of it. Uh, it's a long tradition in Peking University to be part of the curve of history. From the May 4th movement and even before that. And I could sense that among this cohort of fellow students at that time. I learned a lot in the classroom, but I learned a lot more outside the classroom through discussions with them in the roommate, with my roommates, with my classmates, debates, again, about, where should China go? And they themselves went in different ways. Some got into the party and went up. Some got into the government. Others joined the military, but even more, others joined the academe and the business community. And I'm not surprised that they are now the captains of industry. They're now top leaders. But there are also those who are like those in New York who, for what they believed in, have not been able to return to China. They're political exiles.
Right.
And again, that's Peking University spirit, defiance of tradition, conventions, rules, and some paid heavily for that.
In fact, I would bring up, you talk about an election in 1980.
Yes.
This is it's actually a small thing. It was a
The district.
Haidian district council, as it were.
That's right.
Right. But it's so interesting because it was almost kind of a flowering of democracy, if you will, as might be known outside of China, in the West, say, or in liberal democracies. Tell us a bit about that, because that was a kind of informative event for you.
Yeah, it was an interesting, I guess, experiment in democracy, direct elections. Even though it was in a microcosm like the Haidian district, and in our case, inside Peking University as part of that district. I was amazed when it was going on, because I never expected they would even allow it. And in fact, it took the Peking University the principal or the president to allow it, to ward off forces that wished to stop the exercise. But the best part for me was not just the exercise, but the substance of the debates, the campaign speeches that the candidates gave. I was in that crowded hall in Peking University listening to this campaign. It could have been candidates in Canada or the United States or the Philippines talking about national issues. They were not talking about cafeteria food. They were talking about, again, where to China, what they were talking about: democracy, changing the political system. And it was very exciting to just eyewitnesses. Of course, it turned out to be premature. And eventually it didn't flower into a massive democratic movement. But I think there are seeds of that idea, especially among this intellectual elite in institutions like Peking University.
And of course, that was 9 years before the 1989.
Yes, that's right.
June 4th. So there's a lot of context there. Now, I won't say you've retired from journalism. You once a journalist, always a journalist, right?
That's true. Yeah, we never retired.
Since leaving CNN, you returned to Beida as an instructor. So you're teaching a media journalism course, which you described as at core a kind of China 101 course. And you write at length about today's Beda and the students you encounter now. So what's the difference then? Because you talked about that kind of spirit that your classmates, the people you encountered when you were a student, you
Yeah.
talked about their spirit. What's different and what's the same about them and the students you encounter today?
The difference is maybe the age bracket of students these days are much younger than the time in 1977, again, because of the accumulated group of youth who spent many years on the farm before they got into university. So typically the age group of my generation in 1977 were, in the mid to late 20s, even 30s. Nowadays, many of the students are fresh from high school, got into, did well in the Gaokao, and then got straight into Peking University. So they're much younger, but at the same time, they're more, they're better informed in terms of how wide their sources of information are compared to in 1977 or even late 1970s. It was very difficult at that time for students to get a wide range of knowledge or information. Nowadays, because of the social media, they get it instantly, they Google things. So in that sense, they're, widely informed. The difference is also in terms of, I think, passion for change or curiosity. Yes, the students nowadays are just as curious as the elder generation, but I think they probably are less cynical, or they may tend to take in information easily nowadays, not during my time, partly because of their personal experiences during the Cultural Revolution. The students at that time asked a lot of why.
More
Not what.
suspicious, more suspicious in
More
some ways.
suspicious,
Right.
more,
Right.
critical
Right.
thinking. They asked a lot of why questions rather than what, or, the they're more kind of inquisitive, curious, and but again, I think the common thing is that generation and present generation, they all put premium on education.
Right.
They all believe that education is a ticket to a good career, to a good life. That was true before, and I think that's true in this current generation.
Now, is it education at Beda, or are the students you encounter today aspiring really to get educated abroad? Is that the goal for them, for many of particularly the best ones?
Yeah, a lot of them aspire to be able to go overseas, especially for graduate
Right.
classes. Many of them are happy to acquire their bachelor's degree in institutions like Peking University, but most of them, if they can, when they can, uh, are very curious, are very keen to pursue further studies overseas. Again, because they're very curious. They also know it's a ticket to a better career, to upward mobility, and that's true then. That's probably truer now.
Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about journalism, because you were a journalist operating at the very high level of international journalism, operating in China for so many years. What has changed about being a journalist in China from then to today? In particularly, of course, we read a lot about how much more difficult it is now to be an international journalist living and working in China.
It was difficult then. It's still difficult now. It was difficult then in this, when I started in the early 80s. It was, information was very controlled. It was dispensed by the officialdom, but also through the official channels only. And so it was very difficult not to get necessarily to get scoops, but even just to understand what they were trying to do. To answer the whys, the why questions. It was very difficult. And in part because the Chinese media was tightly controlled at that time. There were few, but also the few also talked in unison with one voice. So whatever you read in the People's Daily is the same as what you read in whatever Xinhua news agency dispensed and whatever CCTV on television and radio reported. So it was very difficult. Also, China itself physically was not open. Many places in China were not open to foreigners, especially foreign journalists. So that opened up through the years, gradually, incrementally. And I would say in the mid 80s, things were looking up in terms of the Chinese media itself. The Chinese media became more robust because they were no longer getting subsidy, or their operating expenses were no longer totally.
Particularly in business and economics reporting.
Exactly, and entertainment and sports.
Entertainment and sports, right.
So there was a lot more space for local journalists to work as real journalists. Now, unfortunately, I'm sad to note that in the recent years, there's been a tightening up again of certain rules of how the society itself and sometimes the bureaucracy has clammed up on certain issues and in certain aspects of what we can report. So I would describe working as a journalist as something that you're working within a cage, and the bird flies within that cage. The media, Chinese and foreign media. In the 80s, when I started, the cage was very tiny, and you could only kind of fly within that tiny cage. Over the years, in recent years, that cage has been enlarged, but there's still a cage.
Right. Interesting. Holds a lot of resonance, I think, for those of us here in Hong Kong, in many professions, not just journalism, of course. Now, another irony in your story is that one shared by many of us who left the Philippines because of what was going on under the rule of Ferdinand Marcos. And I myself, I was born in the Philippines, but my family, we moved, we set up residence in Canada. I became a Canadian citizen. You have always stayed as a Filipino. So, but we left because of what was happening under Marcos. Now, the country has just gotten a new leader, a new president, and the name is very familiar, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. What are your feelings about that? Especially, you're right there, back living in the Philippines for most of the year right now, but you spend still quite a lot of time in China. Yeah. What are your feelings?
Well, it's it's the irony is felt, but I feel it's I'm talking like a Taoist. It's a cycle. It's probably a cycle of life. Some things are beyond our control, and this is part of it. I look at it as it didn't happen yesterday, right? The return of the Marcos family
Right.
is a process, and it's probably a product of our time. Uh, we're all a product of our time, and it's a different era in that sense. Just what this era will be like, I think it's we're only in the first week of the new administration. Um, I still hope that that we will finally enjoy some continuity, predictability, a better life for the ordinary Filipinos, prosperity even, and in that sense, my hope is still for the better Philippines, whoever is in charge.
Right.
And I hope they will live up to their expectation and aspirations of Filipinos. The people who elected the new administration have high hopes, and the challenge for them is how to live up to the high hopes and aspirations of those who voted them, and also those the ordinary Filipinos who are hoping for the best.
Now, we're getting close to time, but you've been very generous with your time. Again, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about that future for China. And you talked about the differences and between the hopes and fears of your contemporaries and those of the students today. Well, certainly this is a question that many people continue to ask about China. What is its trajectory? Especially now, given the challenges of the pandemic, we're on the eve of Xi Jinping, the current leader of the Communist Party, getting a third term, and that's created some debate. And of course, we're in the midst of this kind of titanic strategic competition between the US and China, which seems to be sometimes getting worse, but most often getting worse, but sometimes there are some bright spots. What are your thoughts on where China is heading and what lies ahead, particularly in its role in the world?
Well, if I look back
it's a big question,
to the 50 years, the 50 years that I've been through, I witnessed a lot of changes. I mean, the China now was unimaginable 50 years ago. It's unrecognizable for many of us who saw what China was even 40 years ago. So in that sense, it's whatever China has achieved has been amazing. They have conflated, the Reformation and industrialization in just a few decades, right? So that's a virtual miracle. But along with the progress and prosperity that they have achieved, there are tremendous challenges, problems that the current administration face. Ranges from corruption, endemic corruption, environmental degradation, climate change, regionalism, criminality, all sorts. I mean, so in that sense, I understand why the leadership sees the need to have a strong hand to deal with this various difficult problems. And it's like they're playing whack-a-mole. One problem crops up, and then another crops up here, and they can virtually, they don't have the chance to hit everything at the same time. So in that sense, I would see the context of why there is a need for a strong hand, a strong leadership. Um, and the current leadership obviously believes in Marxism and the primacy of the Communist Party. And to them, the ultimate goal is to preserve the rule by keeping social stability, by warding off chaos, and that is shared by many Chinese. This fear of luan, right, chaos or tumult. So that, I think, is what drives many of their action and reaction. This need to keep this 1.4 billion nation together, stable, and whenever they see any appearance of chaos, they want to nip them in the bud.
Right.
The question is for the administration, how they will have to adapt to a very fast changing situation at home and overseas. The pandemic, there's war going on, and then there is this ongoing rivalry, even clash with the superpower, the United States. So they have to manage all this moving parts, all this crises going on around them inside China, and the challenge for them is how to adapt their policies that will suit the aspirations of the majority of Chinese, especially with the emergence of the middle class in China. They cannot be tone deaf to the aspirations of this new middle class, the young generation, who went with the flow of the past few years, but have ever-changing wishes, aspirations, goals, and so I think that remains the biggest challenge for the Xi Jinping administration. They have to be adaptive. They have to be resilient, nimble in policies and in adapting policies to this ever-changing situation.
Interesting. Of course, the need to adapt and perhaps be nimble. I guess for outsiders, when we see the situation with the pandemic, right, it seems that test has been very difficult. I mean, whether they've been able to shift from the very the adherence to that zero COVID strategy to having something a little bit more flexible. It's been interesting to watch. And have you been watching that unfold from Manila for the most part during the pandemic, or were you in China at all during part of the pandemic? Or?
No, I've been watching that unfold since November 2019. I'm very keen to go back to visit, to teach again, and I have been unable to because of that, the very stringent zero COVID policy. So, I mean, I think in many ways, China's success of the past 50 years has been due to that nimble but also pragmatic approach that was taken, during the Deng Xiaoping era and subsequent years. So I would hope that China will stick to that pragmatic, result-driven approach to problem solving, and including solving the pandemic, because I think the choice is tough. What works, what doesn't work, and it shouldn't be a matter of losing face if you shift from one policy to another. I hope they will be driven by reality, driven by results rather than by theory or national pride or face.
Now, Jimmy, I wanted to ask you about a good friend of yours who recently passed away, because of course he's in your story. He was one, along with you, was one of those who were caught in China or had to stay in China in 71.
Yeah.
Ambassador Chito Santoromana, Jose Santiago Santoromana, who was the Philippine ambassador to Beijing, and he passed away suddenly in April. I'm wondering if you could just talk very briefly about Ambassador Chito and what was his significance, because in a short time as ambassador, he really did quite a lot, I think.
He did, and the tributes that came after his death from his peers in the diplomatic community, from his friends, showed that he was a wonderful person, but also a successful diplomat, China hand, China watcher, and it wasn't, it was a big loss for all of us when he passed away. He passed away when he was in quarantine in Huangshan, soon after they completed a bilateral talks with the Chinese side. I believe he didn't die of COVID. He died of cardiac related illness. But I think that many would remember him as a fine diplomat, but also just a very good person.
What was he like?
Who loved his country.
What was he like as a young guy when you guys were back there?
He was our delegation leader when we went to China 50 years ago. Tall, very calm, amiable, and yet very eloquent. He was a very bright young man, and yet humble and very approachable. And he showed that when we were young rebels, but even serving the Philippine government, he showed that temperament, that very even-keeled, calm demeanor. But inside, he was still like determination to do well, to do good for others, but also to do good for the country.
Fantastic. Now, thank you, Jimmy. You've been very generous. I guess my last question would be: is there a sequel to this cinematic story? Because I was so curious about. For example, I would love to know about how you and Anna, your wife, you raised your children in Beijing, and how that went for them, because that to me would be a fantastically interesting story on its own. But also, that whole period of your journalism career in China would I'm sure be quite rich in a lot of interesting stories and tales along the lines of what you've already written down in your book.
A lot of credit goes to my wife Anna and my children for accompanying me through this difficult but also fun-filled journey in China, especially in the latter half of my stay there. I intentionally didn't write much about the latter part, especially the part as a journalist, except in that postscript, in part because I think many of our peers in journalism and many writers have already done very fine job in their books about China, and where it's going, or their experiences as journalists covering China. also because my publisher thinks that, yeah, that's another book. And
Right.
instead we wish to focus on China of the 70s and 80s because I personally witnessed it. And that's what I bring to in this book. And I just want my readers to look back and don't forget this perspective of what China went through the past 50 years as we view China now, because by recalling its history and viewing China now through that longer kind of perspective, we can better understand what China does and what China does not do.
Now, I commend to our listeners and viewers Jaime FlorCruz's book, The Class of 1977. It's published soon, but it's you can order it already on Amazon. So I do recommend that folks look at it and read it, because it really is truly rich in personality, I think. Not only Jamie's personality, but there's so many different personalities in the book, and you can really get into it. It's quite a good read, a thrilling read, and I tell you, it's quite cinematic in its exposition.
Thank you, Al.
So I really appreciate it. So Jaime, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. You're so generous with your time, and I thank you, and good luck. And I hope you stay safe in the Philippines and in your travels wherever you go.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Al.
Thank you.